The laughter in the room stopped when my son pointed at me. "Mom," he said, calm but sharp enough to cut the air. "This dinner is for partners and investors only. You didn't contribute. No free food tonight." Every word landed like glass splinters. People looked away. Someone cleared their throat. And in that silence, I realized he wasn't joking. The plate in my hand slipped, shattered against the marble floor, and something inside me shattered with it. My name is Alexis Bennett, and that night, my son taught me what humiliation tastes like. But on Christmas Eve, I taught him what consequence feels like. I never imagined rejection could sound so polite, not from strangers, from my own son. The night shimmered with silver lights and clinking glasses. Every guest looked like success wrapped in satin and champagne. At the center of it all stood my son, smiling the kind of smile people practice in mirrors, wide enough for cameras, empty enough to hide the truth. I stayed near the doorway, clutching the small box I'd carried in both hands. The smell of vanilla and nutmeg clung to it like memory. And it wasn't just dessert, it was history, one he'd clearly outgrown. When our eyes met, his smile thinned into something formal, rehearsed. His wife, Clara, sparkled beside him in gold sequins, laughing with donors. Cameras followed her like she was royalty. She turned, waved, and motioned to someone to bring more champagne. My son didn't move toward me. He didn't even look twice. He walked over only when a waiter hesitated, unsure where to seat me. His voice was soft, the way a man speaks to an inconvenience. "Mom, the dinner's already arranged. Maybe you can sit near the back." For a second, I couldn't tell if he was embarrassed for me or by me. The words slipped into my chest like cold rain. I nodded, set the box on a nearby table, and stepped aside. The applause erupted when someone made a toast. Low Country table. The pride of Charleston. I watched Clara raise her glass, thanking everyone who believed in us. Her voice was warm, confident, perfect for the live stream audience watching from their phones. Not once did she glance in my direction. Not once did he. The lights burned too bright, the laughter too loud, the music too rehearsed. I stood there long enough for the realization to settle in, somewhere between ambition and applause. My son had learned how to erase me. I slipped out quietly. The night outside was colder than it had any right to be. My breath came out in little clouds as I crossed the parking lot, keys trembling in my hand. Inside the car, the silence was thick enough to choke on. An hour later, I reached the cabin by the lake. The air smelled of pine and damp wood. I lit a single lamp, poured hot water over tea leaves, and sat by the window. The surface of the lake shimmered under the moon, still and endless. My heartbeat stuttered in my chest, unsteady but alive. Somewhere in that rhythm, between pride and pain, I found a thought sharp enough to keep me awake. "You said I didn't contribute. Nathan." Let's see if that's true. Morning came cold and low over the lake. I set about straightening Thomas's desk because small rituals keep the world from tilting, and the bottom drawer had always stuck. When it finally gave, something slid and thudded to the floor. An envelope browned at the edges, his handwriting leaning like the man himself, steady but worn. If our boy ever forgets where he came from, remind him. Not with anger, with proof. A key lay folded inside, stamped with the old bank's crest. The words hit me like a held breath released. Thomas never wasted a moment on theatrics. He thought ahead the way some men stack firewood for winters they won't see. I drove into town with the envelope crumpled in my palm, and the road a ribbon of rain. The bank clerk, young and apologetic, led me to a steel box that had not been opened in years. When the lid rose, the smell of old paper and ink rose with it. Beneath the banded notes were ledgers, certificates, signatures. A purchase made quietly when Nathan was still dreaming at the stove. Ownership, Alexis Bennett. My hands trembled as I leafed through the pages. 40%. Not a token, not a gesture. A stake that could make or break the enterprise my son now called his. Somewhere between his boastful speeches and polished photographs, the seed Thomas planted had been waiting, patient as soil. I laughed then, a small, wet sound, part alarm and part relief. He had called me irrelevant, and I held in my hand the proof that the story was not so simple. It was not triumph that warmed me, but a strange stillness, the sense that an old score had righted itself. Back at the cabin, the wind turned pages on my desk, and Thomas's last line on the back of the note sat like a benediction. Teach him the value, not the numbers. All right, Thomas, let's teach him. Paul's office smelled of leather and powdered lemon. He looked up when I set the files between us, his face a map of years lived honestly. I had expected questions about signatures and transfers. Instead, he spoke softly about ledgers I already knew how to read. Your son's expanding too fast, he said. He's leveraged those shares without realizing they belong to you. If the bank calls, he could lose everything. I poured 2 cups of coffee and watched the steam arrange itself. Patient. The idea that pride could be called in like debt settled over me. It was not cruelty I felt, but a stern clarity. If everything had been given freely, what lesson would remain? If nothing cost him consequence, what would teach him to care? Paul folded his hands. Are you planning to ruin him? His voice carried both warning and a tired tenderness. No, I answered, and meant it. I am planning to educate him. We set things in motion like 2 conspirators of gentle violence. Baybridge Holdings became my shadow name, an ordinary corporate shell on paper with a polite phone number and a bank account. Paul wrote the transfer orders. I signed in a hand steadier than I felt. The assets moved into a place where I could watch without being seen. When I left the city, the rain had softened to mist. In the glove compartment of my car lay Thomas's little notebook. I opened it and scrawled the first line, heavy as a vow. Phase 1. Let him believe I am gone. Under it, in a smaller, kinder script, I added, proof will be love in disguise. It felt like setting a watch to a slow, necessary time. The storm around me was quiet, and underneath it, a plan began to breathe. I hadn't stepped foot inside Low Country Table since that night, but Charleston has a way of shrinking. Secrets travel on the salt air. Pride echoes louder than church bells. When Clara called to invite me to her charity dinner, her tone was honeyed, careful, a little too smooth to be sincere. She said it was for the children's hospital, that it would mean a lot to have family attend. I said yes, though we both knew family meant something different to her than it did to me. I chose a plain olive green dress, low heels, no jewelry. When I arrived, the house was glowing like a movie set. White lights dripped from the ceiling. Camera rigs lined the walls. Champagne flutes caught reflections like glass fireworks. Everything felt staged, polished, curated, every person aware of their angle to the lens. Clara swept toward me, radiant and rehearsed. She brushed the air near my cheek in the shape of a kiss and motioned toward the fireplace. The lighting's better for the live stream, she chirped, before gliding away, her sequins winking under the spotlights. I stood where she'd placed me, a background prop in someone else's perfect frame. The room filled with the buzz of artificial warmth. Clara's voice, bright and practiced, rang out across the hall as she faced the camera. We believe in giving back to those who contribute to our community. There it was again, contribute. I could almost hear the echo of my son's voice behind it. My fingers tightened around the clutch in my hand. I wasn't sure if I was shaking from the draft seeping in through the open door or from anger that had been aging quietly inside me. When I started toward the kitchen to help, Clara stopped me with a gentle grip on my wrist, smiling for the audience even as she whispered, "We already have staff. Alexis, just relax and enjoy." Nathan passed by moments later, his eyes shadowed, movements quick. He didn't meet my gaze. I heard him murmur to Clara, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the chatter. "Make sure the sponsors see us together. They love the family angle." That word, family, tasted metallic on my tongue. I realized I wasn't there as a mother at all, only as marketing material. Applause swelled as the event ended. Clara blew kisses to the camera, the donors clapped, and I slipped out unnoticed, my presence erased as neatly as it had been staged, driving home. The city lights blurred through the windshield. A poster caught my eye on the side of a building, Low Country Table, where elegance meets heart. The slogan glowed in red against the night. Heart. I laughed under my breath. They'd sold even that, and never noticed the heartbeat they built it on wasn't theirs. The next morning, the sky was pale and hard, the kind of light that makes everything look honest. I sat by the window with a mug of coffee and opened the new files Paul had sent from Baybridge Holdings. Pages of numbers, valuations, bank statements, each line another truth my son didn't know existed. He'd mortgaged nearly all of his stake in Low Country Table to finance an expansion in Savannah. If the projections fell short, the bank would take everything. For a long moment, I just watched the lake beyond the glass, calm and indifferent. If love couldn't teach him, maybe loss would. At noon, I met Paul at his office downtown. I laid the folder open on his desk, my finger resting on the property ledger. "Buy the land his flagship restaurant sits on," I said simply. He hesitated. "That's the most profitable corner in Charleston. If you do that, he'll be paying rent to you. He already owes me more than rent." Paul didn't argue. He just nodded, tapping his pen once against the page, the sound of quiet consent. By evening, the transaction was complete. Baybridge Holdings now owned the building that housed my son's pride. No one, not Nathan, not Clara, not the bank, would know whose hand had moved behind the curtain. That night, I turned on the oven. The smell of vanilla and warm sugar filled the cabin. I made the old pudding again, not to eat, but to remember the rhythm of stirring, the patience it took, the small kindness of creation. Under the yellow lamp, I wrote a letter to Paul. Phase 2. Let him believe a savior is coming. 3 days later, Charleston buzzed with rumor. News outlets quoted an anonymous investor group, Baybridge Holdings, expressing interest in rescuing Low Country Table from its financial troubles. I found the article online. Nathan's photograph was centered on the page, all confidence and composure as he spoke to reporters. "We're honored someone believes in our vision," the caption read. I traced a finger across his face on the screen. The son who once told me I hadn't contributed. "I do believe, Nathan," I whispered. "I just stopped believing you." A month later, word spread that Nathan was hosting a private meeting to court potential investors. His flagship restaurant gleamed like a stage set, fresh flowers, polished silver, every seat positioned for persuasion. I arrived early, introduced only as Eleanor Hart, a widow from Savannah with a quiet fortune and an interest in supporting young visionaries. My hair was swept up tight, a pale scarf around my neck, and glasses perched low enough to change my shape. No one looked twice. When Nathan entered, his energy filled the room. He spoke fast, confident, every word sharpened by desperation. Charts flashed across the screen behind him. Profit margins, brand expansion, national recognition. He talked of growth like it was gospel. I watched him and felt the odd ache of recognition, the same fire Thomas once admired in me, before I learned what it cost to burn that hot. When he paused for questions, I leaned forward, hands folded. I said I was interested in entrepreneurs who valued legacy. The word hung there for a beat before I asked, "And what about gratitude? Mr. Bennett? Is that still a currency?" He smiled, a charming, practiced grin. "Gratitude isn't part of our business model, ma'am." The room laughed softly. I didn't. The sound of it pressed something cold into my chest. For all his polish, my son had become fluent in profit but illiterate in grace. I offered him $2 million on one condition: a portion of profits would fund community meals for the underprivileged. He hesitated, then shook his head. "It's not sustainable," he said, polite but firm. I thanked him for his honesty and stood to leave. As I walked out, I saw my reflection in the mirrored wall, older, composed, the ghost of the woman who once believed numbers could measure worth. He wasn't ready, not yet. A week later, I returned unannounced to observe how the restaurant was running. Staff whispered that Eleanor Hart might become their savior. They stood straighter when I passed. But in the kitchen, where the noise of clattering pans drowned out pretense, truth has a way of showing itself. Miguel, the head chef, turned from the stove when he saw me. His brow furrowed, then his eyes widened in disbelief. "Mrs. Bennett? You taught me that gumbo recipe years ago." The room froze for a heartbeat. I smiled lightly, said something about resemblance, but his words had already traveled. From the corner, Clara was watching. She smiled to the others, but her eyes stayed fixed on me, bright with suspicion. That night, she confronted Nathan. "Who is this Eleanor Hart, really?" she asked. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Just an investor." Don't overthink it. But Clara's curiosity was sharper than his exhaustion. While he slept, she opened her laptop, cross-referencing every public record she could find. And there it was, the date of birth, identical to his mother's. Clara closed the computer, the glow of the screen washing her face in cold light. She didn't tell him. Not yet. Some truths are more powerful when they wait in silence. I could almost feel the air tighten from miles away, the way a storm gathers before it breaks. The day of the signing began like every other Charleston morning. Too bright, too still, the kind of calm that hides a storm. The boardroom on the top floor of the hotel was drenched in sunlight. White orchids lined the table, documents neatly stacked, the city skyline glimmering beyond the glass. Everything was arranged for success. Nathan stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, rehearsing charm. His voice carried authority, his posture the perfect portrait of a man in control. Clara sat beside him, silent, polished, her fingers drumming lightly against the pen in front of her. Across from them, I sat as Eleanor Hart, the investor he believed would rescue him. The disguise still fit, my hair coiled tight, my glasses in place, the composure of a woman no one really sees. Paul was there too, playing his part as the quiet lawyer facilitating the deal. He caught my eye once, a flicker of worry moving through his expression. He knew the truth wouldn't stay buried much longer. We were minutes from signing when Clara stood abruptly, the sound of her chair scraping the marble cut through the room. Her eyes burned not with anger, but revelation. She opened the folder in front of her, slid out a set of papers, and tossed them onto the table. The pages fanned across the polished surface, stark and undeniable. "Eleanor Hart doesn't exist," she said evenly. "She's your mother." The room fell silent. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Nathan's pen rolled from his fingers and hit the table with a dull tap. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the hum of the city below seemed to fade. He looked at me, confusion flickering, then horror, then fury. His voice shook. "You lied to me." I didn't flinch. "I only gave you the chance to tell the truth." His jaw clenched, eyes glistening as pride and betrayal collided inside him. All the polish, all the poise he'd built over the years, began to crack. His voice rose, raw now. "You don't contribute, you control." The echo of that phrase hit the room like a ghost returning to finish what it started. The same words that had once gutted me now landed with no weight at all. I felt only an odd, quiet release, not triumph, not revenge, just the heavy door of the past closing softly behind me. "Then earn it," I said, my voice steady. He stared at me as if the words had carved something open inside him. Clara looked from him to me, realizing she'd unleashed something far larger than she intended. Paul remained still, his eyes fixed on the table, as though witnessing a verdict neither of us could avoid. I gathered the unsigned contract, stacked the pages neatly, and slid them into my bag. The gesture was slow, deliberate, the way one folds a flag after a battle. I stood, the air thick enough to breathe like water. When I reached the door, Nathan's voice cracked behind me. "You used me. You turned everything into a game." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. For a moment, I almost turned around. But some lessons, I thought, can't be spoken. They have to echo. Outside, the sunlight hit me full in the face, harsh and hot. The air smelled faintly of salt and smoke from the harbor. I walked past the glass windows, each one reflecting a different version of me. Mother, widow, stranger, teacher. Behind those panes of glass, my son's voice rose again, but this time, it wasn't power. It was panic. For years, I had carried the weight of his words like a wound, but standing there, in that piercing light, I realized something had shifted. The knife he once used to cut me had finally turned in his hand, and as the door closed behind me, I felt the first tremor of what was coming. Not revenge, not ruin, but the slow collapse of everything built on pride. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of wind that carries warnings. Charleston streets shimmered in the glow of festive lights, the air thick with cinnamon and sea salt. I'd been sitting by the fire in my cabin, the radio humming carols I wasn't listening to, when my phone began to ring. At first, I didn't recognize the number. Then I heard it, the broken breath of a man who'd run out of words before he ran out of mistakes. "Mom." The voice cracked beneath the sound of chaos, sirens shouting, the hollow roar of flame. "It's gone. The restaurant. It's all burning." I didn't speak. The silence on my end stretched long enough for him to understand I wasn't surprised. When I finally spoke, my tone was calm, almost gentle. "Then now you have everything." He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Hours later, when the fire crews had finished their work and the last embers died against the cold pavement, I found him sitting on the curb in front of what used to be his flagship. The sign above the door had melted into a half word, the letters warped and unreadable. The air smelled of smoke and wet wood. He looked smaller than I remembered, just a man in the wreckage of his own ambition. Clara wasn't there. I later learned she'd left before the fire was even out. Her last message to him had been brief. "I can't rebuild my image on ashes." By the time Nathan arrived at my cabin, the sky was beginning to lighten. He didn't knock. He just stood in the doorway, soot-stained and hollow-eyed. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I gestured toward the chair by the hearth. He sat, wordless, gripping the mug of tea I pressed into his shaking hands. The sound of the kettle filled the silence like rain on a roof. He stared into the fire, eyes reflecting the flames, His voice was low, rough. Mom, I have nothing left. I took the folder from the side table and placed it in front of him. The seal of Baybridge Holdings glimmered faintly under the lamplight. You owe me nothing, I said quietly. You owe your father's name everything. He looked up, confusion flickering through exhaustion. What's this? Open it. His fingers trembled as he untied the string. Inside were deeds, contracts, letters, every thread of his empire now bound under a single name, Thomas Bennett Trust. The company, the property, the trademark, all of it had been transferred weeks before, under my supervision. For a long while, he didn't speak. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, Why? Because this was never supposed to be about ownership. It was about legacy. Your father built something meant to feed people, not feed egos. You turned it into a mirror. Nathan, and mirrors burn faster than wood. He sank back in his chair, tears cutting pale streaks through the soot on his face. So it's all yours now? No, I said. It's yours, when you understand what it's for. His eyes widened as he flipped through the final page. There it was, in clear print, sole successor and trustee, Nathan Bennett. He pressed his palms to his forehead, shaking his head in disbelief. You gave it to me? After everything I did? I didn't give it, I returned it. But the trust will stay locked until you fulfill one condition. He swallowed hard. Which is? Serve. Don't sell. The words hung between us, heavy as the winter air. I leaned back, watching the fire reflect in his eyes. Your father used to say pride builds walls, while humility builds tables. You tore down every table he made. Now you'll have to rebuild them one meal at a time. He nodded slowly, still staring into the flames. Outside. The wind howled against the cabin walls, the same way it had the night Thomas died. For the first time in years, I saw my son without armor, just a man who had finally run out of places to hide from the truth. After a while, he spoke again, voice breaking. I thought success meant winning. Mom, I didn't know it could mean losing everything first. That's the only kind that lasts, I said. He sat there until the fire burned down to embers. When he finally stood to leave, dawn had begun to spill across the lake, a faint line of gold breaking through the gray. At the door, he turned back to me. Thank you, he whispered. I shook my head. Don't thank me. Thank the ashes. They did the teaching. As the door closed behind him, I listened to his footsteps fade down the path toward the water. The air smelled of smoke and pine and the faint sweetness of hope. Some lessons, I thought, have to be written in fire so they can be read in light. A year later, winter came softly to Charleston. The city lights glimmered against the river, but I didn't head toward the tall buildings or the glittering restaurants downtown. I followed the quiet streets past the old markets and turned onto a lane where the scent of bread drifted through the air. There it was, a small wooden sign painted by hand, its edges rough, the letters simple. Free table. The building used to be a cafe long forgotten, now reborn into something humbler. Inside, the walls were unvarnished brick, the lights warm instead of blinding. A handful of tables lined the room, filled with people who looked more tired than privileged, construction workers, elderly couples, two mothers with their kids, sharing soup. No one was dressed for a photo, no one was pretending. The sound of laughter came from the kitchen. Nathan emerged, apron tied loosely around his waist, sleeves rolled up, face flushed from the heat of the stove. When he saw me, his smile was soft, unforced, the kind that comes only from peace. Come help me serve. Mom, he said, Wiping his hands on the apron, I teased, "Is the food free? For the ones who need it most? Always." He led me inside, and for a moment I stood still, taking it all in. On the far wall hung a wooden plaque carved with my husband's words, "Low pride, high soul, Thomas Bennett." The phrase glowed faintly in the light spilling from the window. A young boy, barely 14, hurried by carrying a tray of soup. He looked up at me with curious eyes. "She's the lady from the photo in the kitchen, right?" he asked Nathan. Nathan laughed, his voice lighter than I'd heard it in years. "Yes, she's the reason we cook." The boy smiled shyly and went back to work, the ladle clinking softly against the pot. I stepped behind the counter, tying on a spare apron. My hands found an old rhythm, the stir of soup, the clatter of bowls, the simple grace of giving. Every sound felt like a heartbeat returned. Through the window, I saw the faint reflection of Christmas lights strung across the street. Not grand, not for display, just enough to make the night feel alive. Nathan moved beside me, handing out plates, greeting guests by name. There was no stage here, no spotlight, no applause. Only the warmth of a place built on humility and redemption. As I ladled soup into the next bowl, the scent of vanilla and thyme rose up, familiar and forgiving. The light from the window washed over the counter, turning the steam into gold. I paused, listening to the quiet murmur of voices, the steady rhythm of a world mended piece by piece. "There's no free food in this world," I whispered. "But love costs everything." The words drifted into the air and settled somewhere between the heartbeat of the kitchen and the laughter from the tables. And for the first time in years, the sound inside me, the one I'd mistaken for pain, was simply peace.